Hello and welcome to the Game Dev Local Podcast. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I am on a Podquest to learn everything there is to know about game development, but you never dared to ask. I'm delighted today to be joined by Amelia Price, and interestingly, Amelia's not directly from games. Amelia, you're from film, I believe. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hi, Oscar. Yeah, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's really exciting to chat to you today. My company is Sustainable Film. Like you say, we work predominantly in film and TV. We also do commercials and sort of everything in between, really. And a new venture for us is to see how we can replicate our learnings from film and TV and kind of support the gaming industry moving forward. There's obviously a lot of crossover, particularly when you're looking at sort of VFX work and that side of our industry. We predominantly do work with productions on the ground, doing the more practical side of things. So it's really interesting to have this conversation with you and kind of learn from both industries, really.
No, exactly. And I mean, just to paint the picture, just a few things. So I can see films like Robin Hood. I can see Mission Impossible Rogue Nation listed. I can see Transformers 5 in there, Spider-Man Far From Home, and a personal favourite, Detective Pikachu. Very games focused, that last one. Anyway, so we're not going to talk about the films. I mean, obviously, feel free, but let's talk a little bit, because obviously sustainability. So what does that mean? We're in a situation where kind of obviously, I mean, at the time of recording, we've just had some interesting news from the over the pond about a certain change of management that's coming. However, let's stay focused on hope and hope for the kind of dealing with the current climate crisis and stuff like that. And I think there's a question here, which is like, regardless of politics, I think there's a general question about what is our responsibility to provide kind of the best possible experience for players at the same time as to have the least possible impact on the world around us, or at least the most positive impact on the world about us that we can have. That's kind of the way I'm looking at it. From a film point of view, what does that look like?
Yeah, and it's one of those things as well. You kind of look at it on two levels. It's like, can people do on a personal level? Like we say, the news recently is, on one hand, if you're engaged in the climate space, is potentially quite terrifying, and it's making sure, from our point of view, and my personal point of view as well as sort of a sustainability professional, to make sure that you don't get down in the doldrums, because one thing we've really learned is that nobody responds well to it's that sort of carrot and stick approach. Actually, people don't respond well to being hit by a stick constantly and being told they have to do things. So we work really, one of the things I sort of pride myself on is how can we inspire people to look at a different way of working, a different way of living, and that's everything from their personal life, but also in their work life. And when we work in sort of film and high-end TV, we're obviously working in some ways across a number of industries. In film and TV, you have everything from special effects people who are really looking, you need a chemicals degree, and sometimes in terms of what the materials that they're working with. And then there's the hair and makeup industry, who are obviously essentially beauty. And then there's costume, who are in the fashion industry. So it's really different, and the work that we do is so different depending on the department. Obviously, costume and construction are using loads of wood, and you have to look at supply chains. But one thing that sort of unites everything is the fact that everybody has a personal vested interest in what their own work. There's always something that somebody can do, no matter how big the scale of the project they're working on. They can still do something within their own role. And I think sometimes people have that attitude of, oh, well, it's so big, I'm not a producer, I can't make any change. And actually, there's so much we can do. And it's people. That's the one thing that's the same across every department and different type of show we work with. It's all about people and winning them over and trying to give them that sort of vision of a more positive future.
It's interesting you say that, because it reminds me of some work we did with a team called Internet of Elephants based in Kenya, who were doing a game. Lots of issues about what happened at the launch of the game to do with timing, because it was launched basically the day of lockdown. It was a location GPS style game. So that didn't work out, sadly. However, the process of making the game was fascinating, and particularly because we got to talk to some charity psychologist people about what worked in terms of making successful charity donations. And it was about putting yourself in the the perspective of what success could look like and how you could positively contribute. In this particular case, it was like if you tell people off about how terrible the way the environment is or the way that animals are being treated in a particular context, no good. But if you put the person in the shoes of a researcher following an orangutan around Borneo, that's a completely different situation. You start opening up the imagination and presenting people with positive choices and choices where they're able to make meaningful contributions, even if only virtually. But then obviously the next stage is to take that virtual and make that more real. But anyway, so I found that your point of view there, that kind of idea, like actually what can we do, is a much more interesting conversation than doom and gloom.
Yeah, we often talk about the three pillars of sustainability being people, planet, and profit. And it's sort of everyone, I think, is really engaged with the planet thing. They understand that planting trees is a good thing to do, and we need to do that in order to reduce carbon. But it's sort of the people and the profit side of things are kind of people, particularly, it's sort of well-being and welfare and making sure that our workers aren't chained to a desk all day, that they do get up and move, because then they are healthier and will do better work ultimately, which leads into the profit side of things. And there's no point us making any content in the creative sector if we're not making money. We are a business and an industry, and we need to make sure that we do things responsibly, but we also need to be profitable.
And it's a difficult one because we're talking about an indie community, which the game dev local groups generally are more indie focused. There is a much more kind of emphasis on the passion, on the, I don't want to say hobbyist, because that's diminishing. I don't mean that. I mean in the sense of like, we want to make great work. We want to make work that expresses something personal, and often the profit line is undervalued. I mean, I happen to be somebody who focuses on the commercial side possibly a little bit too much, but I think there's always a balance in those things. So let's talk about this. So I mean, one of the things you mentioned to me last time we spoke was around things like when you're on set and the leaving the set in at least as good a condition as it was when you went there, and hasn't always been the case. So and that to me seemed to be something that quite inspired you in terms of that. So I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of like what you've seen as being kind of the impact of physical kind of sustainable changes, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned at the start some of my credits, if you like, from those are mainly from my locations days, which is what brought me to this sustainability journey. Essentially, as you mentioned, they are huge productions with a massive footprint in terms of a carbon point of view, but also a physical point of view. They involve lots of people, and that does have an impact. And it was directly through my work there that I really realized the scale of not necessarily just the negative impact that a show can have, but also the positive impact. And when we're working in particularly more rural locations in forests and things, you have to be so careful of how you're using all of your equipment, making sure that you have spill kits under everything in case accidents do happen. You do end up, people do make mistakes, and you can end up with things like a fuel spill in a forest, which needs to be dealt with, which is terrifying. But on the whole, people do know and they are responsible enough in order to clean those things up. And a lot of it is about, in sort of event side of things, people tend to use the phrase "leave no trace," which is a really good way of looking at it. Although I like to try and take it one step further and go, well, actually, yes, we need to make sure we take away everything that we've brought onto site. We need to make sure if we're working in a forest, we're not bringing invasive species in so that we're disrupting what's already there in any way. But we can also leave a positive mark. And we do have resources, and we have fantastic crews with us who are greens teams and construction teams who, and people who do groundwork. So we can do things like leave a site and go, actually, talking to a landowner is like, yeah, we're not going to be able to plant any trees on this site because the ground's not suitable, it's too boggy. At which point we go, well, you know what, we've got these people here, let's build a pond and leave that as a lasting legacy. And that can then be a really positive thing that these productions can have. And I think it's trying to switch that narrative. There have been scenario cases, and if you Google disruptive film crew, there's probably plenty of horror stories that will come up. But
Well, I live very
it doesn't
close to
almost help that, as we want to be productive.
Yeah, I live very close to Farnham Heath, which is where things like Gladiator, where I think I think some Spider-Man stuff's been there. They did the first Avengers film. The opening scene was filmed there, so it's fantastic. And the number of times, particularly the Ridley Scott, the amount of infrastructure they leave in place for weeks and months afterwards is phenomenal, and it's fascinating to watch. But they do eventually clean it up. But I do remember, particularly with the Ridley Scott Robin Hood, the village that they built, that was used in multiple contexts, not just in the village scene. But it was amazing how long that was there. I think it was basically there until the next production. So
that was when we were growing crops, actually.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. So in fact, I don't know if I'm assuming this is the one you were on. The one that I remember particularly is the wagon in Gladiator that they reused in Robin Hood. They left there in the heath for ages. Anyway, I just mentioned that because I'm just showing that, for those who don't know, this is normal that stuff gets left behind, which we don't necessarily expect. But it's also fascinating if you happen to be a bit of a film fan to look at some of those stuff.
Yeah, actually, using things from one show to another, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that's happening more and more now. It's really interesting to see kind of how these props are reused. And actually, ITV have recently launched their own eBay page, so you can actually go and buy things off ITV shows, which I think it's a really positive thing to do. I think as an industry, film particularly is really secretive, doesn't like anyone to know what they're doing. And ITV are really sort of disrupting that and going, you know what, we're just going to sell it, because actually someone might want a lamp from Emmerdale.
Absolutely,
Emmerdale fans.
Of course they will. I mean, let's face it. I mean, there's so much obvious. I mean, the thing in my mind is when you look at some of the legacy of some of the sort of bigger shows, how much of this stuff was like thrown away. I think I had a license for the Rocky Horror Show at one point, and I remember there were the original kind of equipment that was used in the filming of the Rocky Horror Show, the film show, got reused in a number of other films and then basically got thrown away. And I think one of the fans managed to get hold of like the tank that was used. I forget the full details, but the amount of fascination that fans have for this stuff is amazing, and it keeps the identity of that production alive. It's part of the mythos. So I think it's all important. But again, this is the juxtaposition, isn't it? Because we're creating these materials necessary for the production of that show. They're done at variable quality depending on how much the camera is going to get to look at them. But at the same time, they're using resources, they're using time, they're using money. Their disposal is non-trivial in some cases. So what are you doing in terms of helping those kind of teams understand how they take that forward, how they kind of do that better?
It's really broad, actually, in terms of materials. There's some really exciting things happening. We're working with people on things like we sadly the industry uses quite a lot of polystyrene, and for sculpting reasons, there's we've been working with a company who actually produce a compostable polystyrene that's made of cornstarch and sugarcane, which is fantastic, and it means that it can be composted afterwards and it takes longer than a banana skin potentially to break down, but it's in the right conditions. It is a much better product for us to be using because it's not using fossil fuel as an original resource. And then from a reuse point of view, we've had examples recently where a jewelry maker who on a large fantasy show, so that a show big enough to have their own dedicated jewelry maker, and they were actually going around and basically not stealing bits of scrap, but they were basically taking bits of scrap from all of the other departments. So special
Yeah.
effects and will be welding things, and it's like, oh, hang on, do you need that? Because obviously what they need is tiny compared to what
Yeah.
other departments are using, and they use basically everything from all, a bit like a magpie, from all of the other departments in order to make and produce the jewelry that then fitted really well.
Yeah.
So it becomes a creative choice as well, and it's like you can
Yeah.
be a really creative with the resources that you have and that you use. And then on a larger scale, we often talk about carbon and bringing down the carbon emissions, and a lot of where the emissions come from on a production is from transport, flights, people traveling around. So there's obviously a lot we can do in terms of car sharing and trying
Yeah.
to sort of slightly disrupt the way that cast members might be being moved around set, so they're not, get them to car share rather than dedicated drivers. And then obviously, again, if we're in those remote forest locations, then diesel generators currently are in some ways the only option. What's really exciting is there are new fuels coming on board. So there's something called HVO, which is hydrotreated vegetable oil, which is a
Okay.
drop-in fuel. And it's an up to a 90% reduction in the carbon emissions at the point you're burning it. So there's a few issues around the supply chain. You've got to check that you're getting the real stuff, essentially, because with all new sustainable products, people are very quick to copy and relabel it and try and get on the bandwagon, as it were. But that's a really quick way to bring the emissions down. And then obviously there's batteries and hydrogen and things.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some amazing new, kind of improvement in the kind of options for kind of rechargeable battery functions, and the efficiency that solar's getting now in terms of things is becoming a little bit more practical. I mean, you're still not going to be able to just run your, the amount of power usage, I imagine, a film production is incredible, but it also does raise some questions. Like you say, the assumption that we can get to perfect is kind of the problem. And in particular for me, it's like you talked about from the point of use. So obviously there's a whole bunch of questions that go in terms of like the whole supply chain. This is one of the, so I drive a hybrid, and obviously, for me that's great. But if you were to take the full equation all the way back to all of the processes to get that car there, how we're still making an impact. We can't get away from that. But that over time, and it's what I think so important about this is that the intent demonstrated by action to improve the process provides the market compulsion, the market demand for the solutions that's going to improve on that to come. And I think if we just assume, it's not good enough, it's not perfect, therefore, it's the classic thing, in fact, it's the line we use in games a lot, perfect is the enemy of done. So, obviously games, we have a slightly different way of, slightly different problems. We're not generally using the physicality, although that does sometimes happen. We'll often, there are games that use physical models that are then scanned. They are the minority rather than, but there's also, there are location-based processes. For example, there have been some games where people have kind of used drone shots to map out an environment map of a real place, typically kind of somewhere historic or, a ruin or whatever else. And increasingly, as we're seeing virtualized productions in TV, a lot of those resources are very reusable in games. And I suspect we'll see more and more of that happening. But, again, what's going on is largely an energy usage problem. And what I'm really impressed with folks like the SpaceX guys who recently got acquired by Supercell. They're already mostly owned. They're now fully owned. But John and Simon and the rest of the team there have been really, really at the forefront of pushing to a net negative mindset. And when they talk about it from the point of view of not just their use in development, because we've got lots of people sitting there with big monitors and lots of screens and lots of power. But you've also got people with their mobile phones, and those phones have to be charged, and the games are going to use power. How do you calculate how much power was used by your contribution to that? And how do you offset that? So a lot of the work we end up doing is offsetting, trying to find alternative sources. But if you think about it, we are a very server-hungry industry. And even streaming of movies and TVs is a very server-hungry industry. Is that an area that you've kind of seen anyone doing major improvements in the process?
Yes, it feels like an area that is definitely people are kind of going, oh, we really need to talk about this a bit more. I think it's, it's quite complicated, and it's maybe not as, from a kind of particularly a creative sector point of view, it's not as exciting as talking about what people are doing with materials and props and costumes and all of that stuff, because it's data centers and it's
Yeah,
energy and it's power and is utilities. Essentially, it's like, is the facility running on a renewable energy tariff? I mean, that's not really that exciting to have that conversation, but has a
yeah,
massive impact, if and or even down to which energy supplier they're signed up to. It's like, not all energy suppliers and tariffs are built the same, sadly. Some of
no,
them will claim it's renewable, and actually it's a very dark art of them buying and selling credits and things. So it's really not as exciting as it perhaps should be, because it's a massive area of impact. And you're right, every time somebody is watching a TV show or streaming it or playing a game on their phone, it all has an impact. And somewhere on that infamous cloud that we will talk about, it's being held and data is
yeah,
being used and farmed, and there are massive data centers. There are some really exciting projects where it's actually a post-production house called Dirty Looks, who are part of
mm,
the scheme. Essentially, it was on a fantastic, I first became aware of it on a fantastic website and magazine called Positive News, which I highly
mm.
recommend, particularly in weeks like this, if anyone's feeling a little bit low
Sounds like
to
something
read.
I certainly need at the
Yeah,
moment.
positive.news. It's brilliant, but again, they highlight these really good local stories. But I mean,
Yeah,
this scheme in particular, they have put data centers in swimming pools, so
yeah,
they are then using that heat generated by the data centers in order to
yeah,
heat the swimming pool. So, which
yeah.
is such a bizarre. If you think about someone coming up and pitching to you, going, "I want to put a data center, which is basically a box of electrics next to a massive thing of water," it just
I
seems like a
seem,
totally
yeah,
crazy scheme, but
I
it's
seem to
really
remember Microsoft doing some experiments with that. I might be misremembering, but I think they did a whole bunch of experiments on that side. And like you say, cooling, heating, it's a recovery process. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
yes. And a lot of the data centers, you'll find they have to run additional power in order to keep the equipment cool, because otherwise
Yeah.
it's going to overheat.
Oh,
So
exactly.
it seems really, actually, let's reverse it, suck the heat out and use it. And
Yeah.
it's a win-win. So there's a lot of really exciting little projects. If I feel that we're
Mm.
at that stage, sadly, still, where it is people doing small things, and luckily that project specifically is able to scale, but that takes
Yeah.
investment and funding. It's like, as a company, we've done an Innovate UK round,
Oh, yeah.
which was really brilliant to be involved in that
Mm.
process, and it just opens up a whole. You just realise how much is going on in that sort of R&D and innovation
Yeah.
space, which, from a sustainability point of view, it's like that's what we need. We need
Mm.
people doing and trying things, because it's not, you're not always going to succeed. Like you say, it's about, you've got to
Mm.
at least try, rather than going, oh, that's a bit difficult. It's sort of just try something new and have a crazy idea. As a company, we have a on our project management software, we have a little form you can fill in. It's literally called I've had an idea, because it's amazing the ideas you have when you're cleaning the
Yeah.
shower or walking the
Yeah.
dog, and they grow into something really exciting.
And it doesn't matter if they don't. It's
Yeah.
just throw them out there. You never know who they'll inspire. That's
Yes.
the important. And I think one of the interesting things is, if you think about, it's very easy to say, oh, we've been talking about this stuff for a long time. Who cares? Well, for those who don't know, the UK turned off the last coal power station. Now, I mean, that may not sound very impressive, but we are a country that was built on coal as the primary source of power for hundreds of years. It was probably the reason, the coal reserves is probably the reason why the UK managed to build an empire in the scale it did, for the pros and cons of that, and many pros and cons, many cons, and bad behaviors that we did. But the point being, that power source was not one that has been great for the environment. It's now turned off. It has been done. And now there are still other forms of generation which may be not necessarily perfect, but the to take up of renewables, I think there's a point, was it last summer or the summer before, where we hit the point where we had more energy coming from renewables than the country needed.
Yeah, that was last summer. Is it again?
That was last
Yes,
summer.
there's some really good apps you can follow as well and see
Yeah,
exactly where the country's energy mix is coming from.
yeah,
And yeah, like we produce an awful lot of wind, a lot more from solar these days as
yeah.
well. And I think there's a, I work a lot with people who are based in LA, and everyone's
Mm,
going, oh, well, it's fine for everyone in LA. They can have solar power. It's like we can have solar here as well. They
mm.
don't just need bright sunny days; they need daylight. And
Yeah,
actually, the technology is moving on so quickly that we can do an
exactly.
awful lot with that. And it's about almost becoming sort of self-sufficient with our energy. And you're right, we used to dig up
Yeah,
a load of coal and sell it to other people, whereas we need to look at it differently and go, what can we produce ourselves
exactly.
and then not be reliant on anyone else?
And as you say, the efficiency and the materials that are being used. I was looking at. I'm obsessed by this sort of stuff. So they're now talking about dual layer solar panels, which allow different frequencies to basically provide power at different layers, which means you get a much broader spectrum. Yeah, just to be boring, the spectrum affects how much energy. The higher the frequency, the less power that you get per time, but the more the less heat it generates, so it's more efficient. So it's really interesting. Again, I'm probably messing that up. There'll be some people who are experts on it on the line somewhere, and who correct me. But my point is that we've seen a massive transition where early solar panels were like single digit efficiency rates. We're now in the sort of double digit, nearly 20% kind of levels, and which is kind of theoretical limits in some ways for these things. But once you start adding dual layers, you start going to the ability to get like 30-40% theoretically. And I think we're just seeing the start of that. But I don't think the generation part is the problem. I think the problem is storage.
Yeah.
And we still have massive challenges with storage. There's some really wacky thoughts out there about things like raising concrete blocks over time, or generating, having offshore tidal and wind when they have excess power, generating hydrogen from that. And even down to, who was it? Was it? I think it was Toyota or someone like that. I'm not too sure. Producing essentially a hydrogen cell that looks a bit like a giant size AA. I mean, we're so early in the storage. I think yeah. Anyway, the point being is, I think there's lots of things moving forward in this space, but power, I think, is the vulnerability that we in games have in terms of this thing. And it sounds like film has some of that as well as other issues. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I'd definitely say so. It feels like gaming, particularly, is that you don't have all of the sort of I don't want the kind of the smaller bits and pieces, almost as it were. It's just those really key
Yeah.
targeted. How are we going to power things? Right? How are we
Mm.
going to store that energy? Great that we can be now making so much more energy, but actually, what happens on those dark winter days?
Yeah.
Interesting. There's another project that they're looking at using salt and sodium based storage for energy.
Yes. Sodium, salt. Well, it's hard batteries, basically. Solid
Yes, and
batteries. Yeah.
we've actually had a trial of
Mm.
something called a salty dog, which is a fantastic
Yeah.
name for a battery.
Mm.
And so again, really early tech, but really exciting to see
Yeah.
that people are kind of again back to that supply chain conversation of where are all these natural resources coming from in order to build electric cars and batteries and things. That actually this is a different.
I think with those ones in particular, if I remember correctly, they don't generate as much heat. So the solid state model, and I've actually seen some interesting ones around solid state batteries that could potentially be like for laptops and stuff like that, which are also really interesting and may not need quite as many of the rare earth elements. But I might be misremembering that one.
No, I think you're right. That's definitely an area of potential innovation as well. Yes, I think everyone's well aware that batteries are great, but they are not without their issues.
Yeah.
And the sooner we can start addressing those issues as well and working out, making sure that we're recycling all of the bits from old batteries into making new ones, and is the obvious thing to do. But it's not a finite resource. So
no, and the reality is that as a species, we're using more and more power, and we're going to continue to use more and more power. It's hard to tell people that they can't have their devices when everybody else has them. Let's face it, I think it's still the average that it's 1.5 phone or 2 phones per person or something ridiculous on average around the world in terms of active use, let alone, I mean, I've got a stack of devices on my desk right in front of me because I'm a game developer that has to test things on old devices. So, yeah.
On all those different devices, and then what do you do with those devices? Is the same
Yeah.
with, as a developer, you might have multiple screens and they will
Yeah.
have a lifespan. What do you do with them at the end? And
Yeah.
you mentioned sort of virtual reality and virtual sets, particularly. There's a lot that virtual production space. There's so much crossover with gaming and that side of things as well. It's just like, having done a bit of research on that at the time when people were starting to talk about it, and you talk to the experts then who understands how screens work, and they're like, you know what, it's really hard to invest in something like that, because within a year the technology's moved on so quickly that those screens you'll be needing to recycle them and buy a whole new kind of set, and that's hugely expensive and also hugely wasteful. So it's not a perfect solution, although again, from virtual production case, again with game, you're not moving anywhere, you're not traveling people, and again, I think that's what's exciting about gaming as well. It's sort of, you can create amazing stories and creative content that people can really engage with, which at the end of the day, people are not going to the cinema as much as they were. They're watching things differently. They're watching on YouTube, and they are consuming stories, and they want to be part of it, which is the great thing about games, is you can be part of the story in a way that you can't with TV and film.
Well, as I often say, I mean, in games, it's a verb. We do, and I think that's the fundamental difference of the media. And yes, we make more money than movies and music combined, but, well, I said we have done. I mean, I think it dropped a little bit last year. I'm not sure if we went below the threshold, but there was a point during COVID when we were more revenue in games than movies, music, and I think even home entertainment combined, which is phenomenal. But it just shows how we've grown up as an industry, and we've hit our maturity, which is why the last year has been kind of challenging. I think that has an impact on our decisions, because when we are dealing with other complications, our decisions are, does this save me money? And I think the trouble is sustainability kind of potentially the risk is it goes out the window. It doesn't have to, I don't think. I think we can make better choices and still make savings. But I think actually another thing, I think one of the things, as you were talking that through, we hit really on e-waste a little bit there. And I think, recognizing that e-waste is a significant factor of the sustainability problem. For example, at the moment, we generally don't repair items. We generally, there has been some minor movement in that space, but we're using, whether you're a Mac user, I am not, or a PC user, generally you're largely not going to repair the thing. You might upgrade memory, maybe. You're not going to do that on a Mac, probably. You might upgrade the hard drive, maybe. But they're still objects that need to be discarded. They contain gold, other rare earth elements. They contain all sorts of complicated parts that may or may not be genuinely recyclable. And even then, recycling gold involves all sorts of caustic elements. In fact, a lot of the stuff that we talk about recycling generally doesn't get done properly. And I do wonder, how do you feel about that? Because my worry is that some people have become a bit sustainable fatigued because of the false promises that have been made by, even our recycling out at the end of our house, half the time ends up in a crate on a ship to some other country and never actually gets recycled.
Yeah, I think those stories as well are hugely damaging to how people act in those scenarios. In terms of the waste and tech, it's like, I personally buy refurbished phones and computers because those are, obviously I'm super engaged in that. But in terms of what do you do when you get rid of them, there are a lot of companies actually really doing quite a lot, but it's not straightforward. The easy thing for when you're doing something at scale, and there are amazing, if you want to get really dirty one day, you can go to a materials recovery facility, or a dirty MRF as we call it, and that's where they they're literally, there's a magnet pulling out the metal, and there's a jet of air that pulls out the paper, and they
Mm.
will go that extra mile. But you're right, that doesn't always happen. That's sort of, dependent on who's collecting the waste and what contracts are in place, and it's getting very complicated. But from the waste point of view, there is money to be made in that
Mm.
side of things. So if people, it's like my local council has just started collecting small electricals, because
Yeah,
they realise if they can handle it properly, they can make money from it.
absolutely.
I think it's Currys as well, actually, who are one of the obviously large retailers, have actually just announced their own scheme, and they will take larger things because they've
Mm.
obviously realised, it's very good from them from a corporate publicity point of
From a
view for
brand point of
people
view,
to
yeah.
see that. From marketing, it's brilliant, but they are also probably making a little bit of money from, if they can get a large volume of screens and computers and whatever it is that people are bringing, then it's a revenue generator, which I
Mm.
imagine for a more sort of bricks and mortar retail organization like that, it's all about how can they disrupt their business model slightly in order to keep keep going, as it were.
No, exactly that, and I think that's the crux of it. So, and obviously, there's barriers and frustration in the process, but I think hopefully what we're kind of getting across is that there are small steps that we can take. We can look at the way that what is your strategy for dealing with e-waste? What is your strategy for sourcing power? Where you have an option, can you take it? But it doesn't have to be more expensive. But also the fact that the environment around us is gradually, in the UK at least, moving to a slightly more sustainable model, at least hopefully. Um, but yeah, so I mean, I think one of the key areas though is I know a lot of hosting companies, but I have to admit I don't know off the top of my head what their policies are in terms of their power systems. I mean, what do you have any kind of like advice on how could people who want to take an approach, what steps should they think about if they want to take that more sustainable way of operating?
It's definitely, it's all about your energy company as your kind of the big hitters, as it were. That's where you can make the quickest change and
Yeah.
have the biggest impact. And it's literally just looking at what your tariff is, and it should split out on your bill where your energy is
Mm.
coming from. There's some, I think the kind of the companies who are really working well are obviously Ecotricity, Good Energy, companies like that.
Yeah.
It baked into everything that they do, so if you're getting your energy from them, that it's as good as it should be. Obviously, if you want to go a step further, then you can put solar panels on your roof or
Mm.
install heat pumps. You might need to look at insulation. So there's obviously more of a cost implication there, whether you're doing that at home or as a business. It is an initial outlay. So the quickest thing to do is to look at your energy supplier, and then in terms of your sort of wider.
But on that point, it seems to me that remote working becomes a very sustainable way because you're not doing the commute, you're not having to do the hosting of the kind of the person any more than they would need to do anyway. We probably need to think about how we make sure we reward people appropriately for that process, but that's a different subject altogether. But at the end of the day, sourcing your devices, sourcing, it becomes a little bit kind of more personal.
Yeah.
Becomes something you can be more empowered by. Anyway, so I'm very pro remote working. There are downsides, but I'm very pro it.
Yeah, I think you're right. There are so many benefits. It means you can do things like do your washing in the bit. If you, for instance, I have solar panels, I check the
Yeah.
battery level before we put a load of washing on, which
Mm.
sometimes might be in the middle of the afternoon, and then the
Mm.
battery can top up again before we need to cook dinner. So actually, it's yes, as soon as you have solar panels, you get completely obsessed about when you're turning the kettle on. Which I do have an insulated kettle, by the way, so I put it on
Yeah.
in the morning, and I can get 3 cups of tea out of that for the next 4 hours before.
Nice.
So
No,
it's yes, again, I get obsessed about these little things, but it's interesting that working from home model, like, it makes such a difference if you're not going anywhere. That yes, it's really great to be with people and to talk to them, and that side of things, but actually there's huge benefits to home working,
yeah.
and making sure that obviously it's also giving yourself the ability to look after yourself as much. I think is one of the dangers of home working, and actually making sure we all
Mm.
stand up and don't just sit down all day and also go for a walk. I know some people who, when they work from home, they'll have like a fake commute and go for a walk around the block just in order
Yeah.
to reset, because I think there's a danger that that sort of work-life balance sort of bleeds
Oh,
a lot.
absolutely.
And I think that's,
What's work-life balance? Sorry,
apparently there's one, but yeah,
yeah.
I think that again isn't great from a sustainability point of view. If people feel like they are
Mm,
completely chained and overcome by work and things, they don't, particularly in the creative space. We need people to feel relaxed. That's why so many of the
mm.
great sort of tech and innovation companies have sort of, the beanbag area and that kind of
Yeah,
stuff, which sounds crazy but actually is really important from a creative point of view. It's like we have to
yeah.
make sure we're looking after our people as much as anything as well, so that they can create amazing work.
Yeah, and creative work comes out of having the space to do that. I totally accept. Yeah, so, yeah. And I have to own up to being a complete hypocrite, because I believe in all this stuff, and yeah, I don't have the solar panels. I don't have the most eco-friendly processes. I do. I have ticked the energy company renewable button, but I've gone from, I think it's EDF or something we use, but rather than the sensible like ones we know would actually do the thing properly. So I'm very aware that I'm a total hypocrite, but and let's face it, also flying. A lot of what I do is going to different countries and talking to developers, and my carbon footprint is probably the worst on the planet. I mean, not the worst, but it's just not good. But I think that accepting what you can do and what you can't do, I think, is the first step. But there are, making sure that you do something. I think, that you do aim to minimize where you get the impact that you have. And I don't offset personally, mostly because it's expensive to do so. But what's your feelings on that kind of offsetting process?
I think when it came around, it was really exciting. It was a new
Mm,
idea. People were going to put money into good causes, and
yeah,
that's obviously always positive. I think it's been probably not despite. I'm trying to think of the right word. Sort of almost stolen as an idea,
yeah,
and now it's become a thing. Oh well, I'm offsetting, so I don't need to worry about anything else. And
yeah,
actually, yeah, you're right, I don't actually personally offset. I put
yeah,
money into things like having solar panels instead, because
yeah,
I know where that's going. There's a sort of phrase of insetting now, and I think people are actually much more engaged with that. And it's like, actually, I'd rather go
yeah,
and litter pick the street with my kids at the weekend and have a
yeah,
positive impact there, and plant a tree in the park if someone snapped it off or whatever, which sadly seems to happen quite a lot. But it's that side of things. It's having a meaningful engagement
mm,
that you can see is
yeah.
actually happening. And I think there's sadly, offsetting is fantastic, or it could have been fantastic, but it's
Could have
just
been,
been
yeah,
really hijacked, and it's
yeah,
lost that element of trust really. And people don't. There's a few schemes that we do use that you get sent a photograph of the tree, the sapling being planted,
mm,
and the GPS coordinates, so you know exactly where that sapling is, which is brilliant. But
yeah,
there's still that sort of slight distrust about it all, and ultimately we just
yeah,
need to be bringing down our emissions. But we do all need to fly somewhere still at
yeah.
times. It's just the reality.
No, exactly. I'll give you an example. So a friend of mine, Laura Carter, who runs Trees Please, their merge game, they actually plant trees. So when people spend money, they're planting trees. And so, there are teams out there that are genuinely committed and absolutely doing their part. And I think I'm also very lucky that I got invited to the launch of Play for the Planet, which was done the GDC before COVID hit us all, and I got invited to the launch there. And I think this is the other aspect I think we can do in games, which is incredibly powerful, and I think film does to us have this potential similarly to a certain extent. So in the room for that particular dinner, we worked out that there was about 250 million daily active users. Think about that.
Yeah,
250 million, represented by about 20 companies.
and the power that they
The
have.
power of that, and this. I mean, the Sam Barrett at UN Environmental, the person who kicked that off, did a fantastic job, and they're still doing this stuff. And there's lots of games signing up to that. I was really delighted walking around Gamescom this year in Cologne, one of the biggest shows in the games industry, and the number of stands that had a sign with a QR code saying "Play for the Planet" was really made me happy. And they do things like, like clean up your beach. So you might have Niantic doing a Pokemon Go event where they encourage you to go and clean up on your beach, or King doing something similar. And I think this is actually, I think, the most impactful thing that we can do. And whilst it's about players, about consumers, about real people, we're all real people, but you know what I mean, people at the end of the game experience doing something, I think it's more than that. I think it's making a statement about what we want to have as a population, as a society. And I think those impacts that we can have by putting you, the player, in the shoes of somebody who can make a meaningful difference changes hearts and minds in a way that is very hard to do just by shouting that we've got a climate problem. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, I 100% agree. I think the opportunity of particularly games from that immersive point of view, film and TV, everyone points to Don't Look Up as being a kind of an example of where that's really happened in terms of bringing climate change into the narrative. But I think the opportunity for real sort of meaningful behavior change is huge, particularly in gaming. And I think you can look at it from the slightly negative side of point of view and go, you know what, you can really have somebody immersed in an environment where they are affected by wildfires or flooding, and that could be potentially quite a horrific experience to be part of that. But if that's what motivates people, but then on a positive point of view, it's how do you then start normalizing the behaviors that help to change and to bring down to solve the issue of climate change. And I've sort of joked for a long time that I have a little dream that one day in a Mission Impossible film, Tom Cruise is going to step out of a shop with his sort of reusable coffee cup and his reusable tote bag over his shoulder, and then jump off a cliff or something. But as soon as those behaviors become normalized, that will have a massive impact. And it's about how do you go to the shop and change what you're doing.
No, I totally agree, and I think that's really the crux, is that I think that normalization. I mean, you made me think, actually. I mean, I kind of now want to go and make a game about a tornado is coming, and set in the Midwest or whatever, and having to do the actions like moving away your furniture. You could train people essentially on emergency practice, how they can survive that, and it not even be a training thing. It's just the game.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be interesting?
I think that's fantastic. I have family in Australia who have a grab bag for wildfires, essentially.
Yeah.
So they are prepped, ready to go. And it's
literally.
Again, where I live, it's quite prone to flooding. So there are families here who have a boat, even though they don't actually use it. It's there, ready for if they need to use the boat to get down the river, to get down the road, essentially.
Down the road, literally down the road, because the road might flood.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm lucky I'm on top of a hill, so I don't have that particular problem. But I've got a friend of mine who's, in middle of Aldershot. You wouldn't expect there to be flooding, and yet his street, number of times it's been completely taken over just because it happens to be slightly lower than the other parts of the town. And if there's a lot of water, you never know.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing I think is really interesting, is that there's so many different angles that we can take this question about sustainability. I think you've got the angles of like the kind of onus on us to do something for our own, our own sake. What can we do? But I think equally, knowing that we do what we can, we don't necessarily have to be perfect. I think there's also the communication side. And I think the communication we've explored does not have to be beating you over the head with a moral rule book. Instead, to demonstrate through action, through choice, the benefits and the risks and the challenges. And I think we can have a more honest, more kind of engaging, more entertaining journey through using games in ways that almost no other media can deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got me thinking about how we can use games now to train people to get out of wildfires and tornado situations.
Honestly, there's a whole subgenre in VR games called blue light experiences, where basically it's a serious games model that's intentionally for training people like firefighters or whatever else in order to deal with situations. And imagine that in VR. I mean, this stuff. I mean, it's amazing. I've seen some amazing things. Anyway, but no, I mean, obviously, if you want to do that, I'm sure there are listeners who are trying to do this kind of thing already, and they can check out the Discord and tell us all about it. But equally, obviously, if you guys ever want to do stuff, we know a few people who can do that sort of thing. Absolutely. So, on that note, if you wanted to sort of give the one thing, the two things that you think people should and can do right now in order to take the sustainable journey, what would those things be?
Obviously, we've talked about it a few times, but definitely change your energy supplier. It's the quickest way to change overnight and have a real impact. And in terms of something, I think it's that general attitude of that keep positive, of there is actually a better way to do things. And as soon as you start sort of almost like living and breathing the fact that it doesn't all have to be negative, it doesn't have to cost you more, like things like using a zero waste shop to cut down on your plastic use, and it really spirals. And the more that you start to do those little actions, the more you get it just becomes normal, and you become more engaged, and before you know it, you're far more sustainable than you were 6 months ago. And also you feel like you're having a positive impact. And that is hugely powerful, because that's how you bring other people on that journey. If you're, like we said at the start, if you're kind of talking in a negative way, that's really off-putting for a lot of people. If you're inspiring and wanting to bring people and encourage them, then it really makes a massive difference. So before you know it, you'll be influencing other people, and that will then filter into the work that you're creating, and you'll be influencing, potentially, as you say, millions of users.
Exactly. And on that note, if people want to get hold of you or talk more about this subject, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn. It's Amelia Price, and Sustainable Film is our company. Our website is sustainablefilm.green, and there's sort of contact forms on there to get in touch with us as well. And yes, always happy to chat about anything sustainability related. It's kind of what we live off, as it were.
Sounds great. And so that's us. We've been talking about sustainability. We've been talking about the things that you can do and the importance of being able to inspire and encourage people to look at what's possible rather than to angst about what isn't. So thank you very much, Amelia, for joining us on that. And if you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, tell other people about it. If you want to talk more, come and join us in the Discord. Come and talk to us and see what, say what you've got to say about the subject, and see what other people want to say about what they can do. And hopefully together we can find new alternatives, new options that can take us all forward in a slightly more sustainable way, even in, as we say, slightly less positive days that we've had over this week. I say this week, but of course, the day that this goes out on the podcast might be many weeks from now. So in case you're worrying, this was recorded on the 7th of November. So anyway, on that note, thank you very much, guys. Please, again, like I say, like, subscribe, join the Discord, do the things that one does, and tell us what you think. So thank you very much for joining us.